Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of Return of the Obra Dinn, where I spoil the adventure and tragedy of the Return of the Obra Dinn. If you haven't already had a chance to play this, please stop. Just stop, pause the video now, and go play it. You're really missing out on a fantastic tale. So to preface what we're about to go through, you are an inspector assigned with the task to go through and identify everyone's tale on the ship of the Obra Dinn. There's 60 people to go through, everyone has a very diverse background, and of course Lucas Pope isn't going to make it any easier for you to understand what is going on. Being that it's a puzzle game, Lucas Pope wants you to follow the flow of time for every single passenger, no matter how convoluted it may seem. And trust me, every single person has their friends, their habits, where they tend to be, where they tend to sleep, where they're required to be on the ship, so don't feel too overwhelmed when you are literally overwhelmed with information. But the one thing that you can know is that the map is absolutely useless. The only thing that you can really glean from the map is that time is passing, so don't worry about coming into this stupid thing. So with that out of the way, let's get through all 60 identities and fates, so everyone can live happily ever after. First person on our list is Captain Robert Witterel. You can tell that he's the captain because he has the fanciest hat. But if you couldn't already glean that with not knowing any nautical knowledge, during the encounter of the very first scene, you can see that the other crew members call him captain before they open the door. The captain's cause of death is suicide by pistol when he reveals to his recently deceased wife Abigail that he had killed first mate and brother William Hoscut. He was, of course, by far the easiest to identify, so let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Next we have First Mate William Hoscut, who was, of course, shot by Captain Witterel. The way that we figured this out is through confession of the captain, who admits to shooting Abigail's brother. So, with these very specific pieces of information, you can now go back and glean the identity of the 4 people who entered the room. So we can see that of all the individuals, this is the only one who was shot, so this is Hoscut. Next up, we have second mate Edward Nichols. Nichols is actually quite easy to identify since Nunzio Pasqua identifies him and talks to him during this scene, during which Nichols is actually trying to extract the treasure from the ship with the help of a bunch of other sailors. It is further revealed when he comes back as the only survivor that he is shot by Chi Tan through the porthole of the ship. At least I think it's a porthole, could be a cannon hole, but who cares? Anyways, on to the next person. We have third mate Martin Perrott. Perrott is easily identified during Abigail's demise, as it can be seen that they are having a conversation while Abigail is looking for the captain. So the telltale sign that you want to see here is the fact that there are 2 individuals having a conversation, which is obviously recorded in the dialogue record of the notebook. Perrott meets his demise during the bargain when he is spiked by a terrible beast. So, next up we have 4th mate John Davies. Davies is also one of the easier ones, but it also incorporates a brand new mechanic into deduction. So, when we are in the scene where Nichols is executed by Chi Tan on the boat when he's bringing the treasure back, we can see that there are only 2 officers present, which might be able to give you the automatic clue that he's there. But what you could notice is that he is looking through the window of the 4th mate's cabin. So if we look at the map, you can scroll down and see that we are actually standing just below the 4th mate's cabin's window. So this should be your easiest indication of who this is, because things become a lot more difficult when people are not wearing their hats. The 4th mate meets his demise by Seaman Brennan when he is clubbed in the back of the head, not wearing his hat. So whenever you're trying to identify someone, make sure that you're zooming in and seeing what their picture actually looks like in the photo. Next up, we have the ship's bosun, Alfred Klestil. His identity is revealed when you see him coming out with rope during the Philip Dahl leg cutting scene. If you go to your map, you can actually go down to the cargo hold and see on the right side of that ship, the entire right side of the ship is the bosun's store. Where Alfred Klestil meets his demise is during the first part of the escape, when he goes into a chair and asks where his Frenchman is. His Frenchman obviously being the bosun's mate that we'll find out about later. There's the Frenchman. So, cause of death is torn apart by the beast, as you can see here. Next up, we have Bosun's mate, Charles Minor. He is one of a couple people that you actually have to pay attention to association when people are traveling together. You'll often see him walking around or in scenes with the bosun. And really his only telltale sign is that he is the only Frenchman. So you get kind of an easy piece on one side and a harder piece on the other, knowing that there's only one Frenchman on board. His cause of death, while not apparent because this is actually the last scene that you see the Frenchman, it is later revealed in a conversation when the bosun asks about his mate that he was torn apart. Next up, we have the surgeon, Henry Evans. His identity is another one of the easiest ones. You can see him doing doctorly things in doctor parts of the ship, often attending to major events and given quite, I would say, high standards by the rest of the ship. There's the surgeon's mate, who we'll get to later. But it's kind of, you'll always see the doctor or surgeon in situations where someone needs medical attention. As you can see, we're in the surgery during this scene. Henry Evans is one of the few people that doesn't die on the trip to the Obra Dinn because he was able to escape. And during the letter, we can see in that second last paragraph there at the bottom, he wants the book sent back to the French Office of Affairs in Morocco, which means that Henry Evans is in Africa. Next up, we have surgeon's mate, James Wallace. James Wallace is another one of those people who you have to see by association. The surgery might not be the best place to identify him at first, but you'll generally see him accompanying Evans. Unfortunately, James Wallace dies during the Soldiers of the Sea. You can either say that he died by being clawed or by being decapitated, because either way, both kind of work, sadly. Next up, we have the Carpenter, Winston Smith. Winston Smith is probably one of the more difficult ones to figure out, not because you don't see him doing carpenter things around the carpenter's shop, with obviously the carpenter's mate, but his identity isn't apparent until we figure out the carpenter's mate's identity. Yeah, and of course if we look here, you'll see that they're both in the carpenter's shop. Where Winston actually meets his fate is during the Soldiers of the Sea. He is stabbed by a spike. Now, to get the full understanding of how Winston died, we want to look at the carpenter's mate, Marcus Gibbs. During the scene where Marcus Gibbs is killed, this is kind of like the first time that we get to see them interact with each other. So of note, I want you to take a look at this axe. It's very important. The axe is what he says when he goes, "Hey, catch." And you can also see that because he is dead, he refers to Winston as boss. And so if you have any doubts about how Marcus dies, you can clearly see him in the event being sadly spiked to the wall by a terrible beast. So, next up, we have Thomas Sefton, who is the cook on the ship. His identity and death are kind of all wrapped up in the single episode, we'll call it. In this part, you can see that he gets slapped in the face by a tail while holding kind of like a barbecue skewer. And so if you actually go in and listen to the dialogue, you can see that he says, "Give it to me and I can fry us up a solid meal." So next up we have the butcher, Emil O'Farrell. His identity is quite easy. You can see him in numerous occasions just interacting with livestock. Not too much to spoil there. And his death is obviously very sad as he gets spiked during the Soldiers of the Sea event. Next on our list is the gunner, Christian Wolff. Christian Wolff is quite an easy one to identify, simply because you can see him in situations where he is coordinating any sort of, I guess, gun activity. And of course, his name is just blatantly stated by the captain during the execution. His death, though, you can blame it on two things. You can either say that he is exploded, or if you want to go for extra points and kind of ruin someone's legacy, I guess, you can also go in and figure out that in the scene before he gets exploded, we can see that Abraham Akbar actually is the one who is firing the cannon, or I guess lighting the fuse. The next person on our list is actually the gunner's mate, Olus Wiater. He can often be seen accompanying Wolff, and his identity is kind of easily seen during the Soldiers of the Sea part where Zonghe actually dies, the ship's steward. And so if you stand in this port window, you can actually see that they're standing right inside the gunner's store. And of note, this is the only time that you can actually see the gunner's mate interacting in the gunner's store. But you can also see just right nearby, he's not too far away from the gunner, if you wanted to use this part as his kind of association. But ultimately, the gunner's mate will meet his demise at the hands of fourth mate John Davies by a pistol shot in the face. This, of course, was after the fact that he was discovered as being part of a mutiny plan that I guess was foiled. So next up, we have the purser, Duncan McKay. His identity is a little bit easy. You might have to do a little bit of observation. You can see when he is on the escape boat, he is actually holding all of the ledgers for the boat, which might make you assume that he is the purser. The purser unfortunately meets his demise when the Kraken attacks, and you can see that all three people that were trying to escape on the boat were flung out. Now, I believe Duncan is the only face that you can see, so we'll just use this fun reference to refer to the other people who die. So next up, we have the helmsman, Finley Daltor. For me, it was really easy to figure out who the helmsman is. Quite honestly, if you look at the sketch of the life aboard the Obra Dinn, he is the only person who is ever allowed to touch the, I don't know what's called, the steering wheel of the ship. So to me, that was kind of like the easiest way to identify him. Nobody else will even get close or touch it. And as the helmsman is really only featured in two scenes, you can see that he meets his demise as the Kraken pulls him out into the sea, in which we can say that he is drowned. The next person on our list is Edward Spratt. He is the artist for the Return of the Obra Dinn. You can see him in kind of really weird scenarios where he has his book out. I guess this is where you see that he is drawing the actual Justice at Sea sketch, and very likely the other one. But this is the only one that I could actually see that you can actually be a full presence of from his perspective, I guess. Edward Spratt obviously dies the most honorable death, death on the shitter by crushed beast. Quite a hilarious scene. So after Edward Spratt, we start getting into the passengers. The first one, of course, is Abigail Hoscut Witterel. She is the sister of First Mate Hoscut and wife of Captain Witterel. Yeah. Her identity is kind of super straightforward. She is revealed to by name during the suicide of the captain. Her death is being struck by rigging, so we'll say that she is crushed by rigging as she goes ahead and takes a mast right to the face. The second passenger on our list is none other than Nunzio Pasqua. He really only exists for one part of this game, I guess. It is revealed that during the setup of Hokseng Lao for Nunzio's death, he is stabbed by Nichols. Identifying Nunzio is a little less straightforward. You can tell that he is Nunzio by his semi-okay Italian accent. The next two passengers on this list you kind of want to identify together. The first one is Emily Jackson, and the second, of course, being Miss Jane Bird. The reason I kind of grouped them together is when you go around the ship in different scenarios, you'll kind of see them stick together. There isn't really a time that you'll see them apart. And this kind of adds to maybe Lucas Pope having an extra angle for you to misidentify passengers. But we see during the escape that Emily Jackson is actually still wearing her wedding ring, which is why we would not refer to her as Miss Jane Bird. Miss being the obvious denomination for single. These two, along with everyone who got on this boat during the escape, successfully made it into Africa when they accompanied the surgeon to Morocco. Next up, we have the Formosan royalty passengers, starting with Bunlan Lim. During it, you can see that Itbing Sia refers to Miss Lim as kind of the only two Formosan passengers during the calling journey. Miss Lim doesn't really make it back from this trip, as she is clawed by a mermaid, which can also be called, I guess, a terrible beast. So, accompanying Miss Lim is Itbing Sia, who is identified during the calling by Mrs. Lim just in that third point there, when she refers to Bing grabbing the chest and obviously setting himself on fire with the liquid quicksilver. Next up, we have Chiho Tan. Chiho Tan is another one of the individuals that we kind of have to deduce the fact that we know the three others' identities, obviously the couple and Hok Seng Lao, who is executed early on when we deal with Nunzio's death. So I guess before we jump the gun, this is Hok Seng Lao. His identity is kind of revealed to us by the captain when he is found guilty by self-confession to the murder of Nunzio Pasqua, which is kind of weird because I don't think he speaks any English in the whole game. But the real tricky part about this is you'll see that he is executed, and what you'll see is you have 4 gunmen here, and what you have to do is trace every bullet kind of like spray path to actually see who hits Hong Sek Lao. So we'll see O'Hagan takes a shot, O'Hagan's shots miss. Who's the next one? That is John. John misses. The next one is the Russian. The Russian misses, but on the end, we have Brennan. Here we go. Henry Brennan. And so if you follow his bullet path, you'll see that this is the only shot out of all of them that connects. So next up, we have the ship's steward, Zungi Sathi. Zungi is very unique in the fact that I deduced who he was because he didn't quite fit the role or a piece of any other puzzle. You can see that he goes and dies by himself. He doesn't really hang around with anyone. And so, yeah, it's kind of weird once you start identifying all the other people on the ship that Zungi Sathi is just kind of the person who falls into place. Now, you might be mistaken into thinking that Zungi was spiked, but as you get into, I guess, his death, what you actually have to do is look through each and every one of these portholes, because he is actually shot. So we look at the captain, we can see that the captain's rifle is actually pointing the wrong way, very important to figure out, and what you see is Charles Minor is the one who is actually shooting the gun. You don't get to zoom in on Minor, but his appearance gives him away. Next, we get into the lackeys of the ship, starting with the captain's steward, Philip Dahl. Philip Dahl is inferred to by the captain for his 20 years of service, but he has gone literally stark raving mad when he hears about this treasure, and unfortunately suffers the same fate as It Bing Sia when he reaches in and burns himself to death with the liquid quicksilver. After Philip Dahl, we have the first mate steward, Paul Moss. Paul Moss is kind of revealed to us during the escape. You'll hear that one of the women on the boat actually calls out to Paul to warn him that Volkov was walking up, and he meets his end when Volkov stabs him with his sword. The second mate steward is another person who you have to identify by association. You can see him often whispering into Nichols' ears in scenes, and also accompanies him during the calling. He is one of the people on the boat who is eventually stabbed by It Bing Sia while guarding the treasure chest that contains the conch shell, I guess. The next person on our list is the third mate steward. Very much the same as the second mate steward. You kind of you understand who he is by association. You'll often see him walking around with the third mate and just kind of doing grunt work, kind of like what a steward should be doing. Unfortunately for the third mate steward, he is crushed by a cannon during the doom. But this is also another situation where you can turn around and see that the third mate is actually running to try and help his steward. And after that, we have the fourth mate steward, Davy James. Just like the rest of the stewards, you can kind of understand his identity by association, standing with fourth mate John Davies. I don't really know if there's much else that actually sets him apart for this fact, but he is one of the, I guess, group of people who do escape to Africa during the escape with Henry Evans. Next up, we have the midshipmen. The first one we're going to talk about is Peter Milroy. This is Peter. He is the one on the far left. The way that we actually figure out his identity is a little bit of a roundabout way. During, I believe it's Thomas Lank's death, he refers to Pete as he wasn't able to pull him back in. which allows us to actually to connect to his death, as we can see Thomas Lank here pictured on the right is actually holding a rope that is trying to pull Pete back in while he was in the grasp of the Kraken. Unfortunately, Pete explodes when one of the other sailors actually throws an explosive at him. I guess it was they just referred to it as gunpowder, but if you just pick explosion, it's probably okay. So continuing to talk about the midshipman, our next one is Thomas Lank. He is another one of these individuals that once we are able to glean all the information about the three midshipmen, you're able to deduce which one is actually Thomas Lank. So during the scene with the bosun's death, we can see that the gunner's mate and the fourth mate are talking about mutiny, and it just so happens that this midshipman is walking up right during this conversation. During the altercation, the gunner's mate will actually run up and stab the midshipman, which surprisingly causes the fourth mate to shoot the gunner's mate. But in the end, there was nothing that could be done, as Thomas Lank dies kind of in conversation in the arms of William Hoscut, the first mate. Next person on our list is Midshipman Charles Hirschtick. Charles is the one who allows us to figure out who Thomas is by deduction. Charles is easily identified during this scene when they ask if Charlie had ever been on a farm, as he proceeds to throw up at the sight of the murdered cow. His death, though, never really made a whole lot of sense to me. He dies by burning, but it's not really clear whether or not he was grappled or stuck or couldn't escape the soldiers of the sea. But next on our list are the topmen, and oh boy did I have a fun time with the topmen. Topmen are kind of nice in that you can easily glean which people are topmen for the fact that they all hang out at the top of the ship. So while you may catch them on the top deck, these are the people that you will find climbing the ropes, climbing the riggings, and generally being on the top of the boat. So, to begin screwing up everyone's names, this one is Topman Omid Gull. He can be identified by the fact that he is always wielding his scimitar, and his scimitar can be seen hanging next to his bed, number 36. His death is the fact that he gets thrown overboard during the doom. The next top man on our list is Timothy Butemint. He is one of the actually harder top man to identify, simply because he only really shows up in one scene, but it requires you to go back and identify his bed and see that he actually has a tattoo of a woman on his arm. So when you get to the point where you can see him clearly, you will definitely see that his tattoo is standing out right in the open. So obviously regarding his death, he is shot by second mate Nichols during the setup for the calling scenario, where they are all currently trying to escape with the treasure that they've stolen. So next, top man Huang Li, and this would probably be a good time to talk about the Asian top men. You'll see that they all kind of hang out together, so we have 39, 40, 41, 38, and then randomly George Shirley, number 59, all hanging out. But realistically, there isn't too much that stands them out or makes them unique in any sort of like scenario or action or even like characteristics or qualities. The way that you need to figure out which Asian on this list is which is by shoes and socks. So Hong Li's giveaway is he is wearing slippers. So when you go up into the scene where he is being electrocuted, obviously death by electrocution, you can actually spin around and look down and see that he is actually wearing those very same slippers. Right? Obvious. So, when we talk about top man Ji Zhang, I wonder what we're going to have to do. It couldn't be that we have to look at his striped socks that he is wearing and then go back up to the top of the ship and see that he is wearing those striped socks. But that's how you identify him. Ji Zhang meets his fate during the Soldiers of the Sea event when he is clawed, or I guess decapitated, alongside the surgeon's mate. So, it should be no surprise when we go and talk about Li Hong that we have to figure out that he is wearing just kind of like regular shoes. And so we see the shoes in the boat, we see the shoes that he's sleeping with, and this is how we associate who he is. Ji Zhang's life ends during the calling when we see that he actually gets spiked by a mermaid. So, terrible beast, same thing. And so, when we get to the final top man, Wei Li, you're like, what kind of shoes or socks could this guy possibly wearing? But no. In the end, you can actually see that number 41 is shown with him sitting in front, because he is the only Asian top man to actually survive Chapter 6, which doesn't mean that he actually lives through Chapter 7. His death is actually an easy guess. You can say he was either thrown overboard, drowned, or crushed by the Kraken. So, now that we got the hard part out of the way, we can talk about top man Nicholas Witterel. You can see that he's actually referred to when we learn about the Carpenter and the Carpenter's mate, when they say that it's already done for Nick. So, if you go out and you actually look around, you can see that no one else on the ship is actually dead during this event, except for the top man who was electrocuted previously, and Nicholas Witterel, who was speared on the floor. Next up, we have top man Maba. He can be identified by his very unique tattoos from Papua New Guinea. It's kind of weird. I would associate him being a little more dark-skinned from Papua New Guinea, but nevertheless, he is torn apart by the beast during the doom. After that, we have top man Lewis Walker. Lewis Walker is probably one of the more unique individuals just because of the fact that he makes it all the way to the final chapter, the end, and rightfully so. As you go to explore the boat during the investigation kind of phase, you can actually go to the end of the boat and see that he is the only one that still has a cot hung up. But obviously that didn't stop him from getting clubbed in the face by a naked Captain Witterel. So yeah. So, the final top man and the next two seamen I kind of want to address together. They're kind of like the Russians. So we have Leonid Volkov, we have, I believe this is Alexei Toporov, and then finally Alarkis Nikeshnin. Great. So we can see that they're obviously number 47, and on the other side we can see that it's 45 and 46 respectively. So it kind of just outlines, the Russians, the top man, the seaman, and the other seaman. So first up, we have Leonid Volkov, the top man. We can obviously identify him as the Russian top man because he is the only one who we could find at the top of the boat. But we can also see that he was shot in the chest with a rifle by Emily Jackson after he had killed Paul Moss. Next on our list is Alarkis Nishkin. He can really only be identified once you've identified the other Russians, but in order to keep this kind of in logical order, I'll just list him now. His death comes during the calling when he is dragged overboard or drowned by a terrible beast. But in order to identify Alarkis, we need to know Alexei Toporov, who was drowned by a beast as well during the calling. But we identify Alexei by his pipe that you can see here pictured in his satchel. When we go to the final death scene, you can actually see that he is pulled overboard and drowned while having that pipe in his possession. Next up is Nathan Peters. Nathan Peters kind of identifies himself when he clubs Lars Lind after accusing him of killing his brother during the accident with a cargo at the very beginning of the game. The way you can deduce this is you can actually go into the crew list and kind of pick out who has similar last names, and obviously he's not going to be the captain's bride, so Peters kind of stands out with Nathan. We can also deduce that he is Nathan because Samuel doesn't appear in any other episode. Want to know what happens to Nathan? Bye-bye, Nathan. Up on the list is Seaman Lars Lind, who was clubbed by Nathan Peters just in the previous episode. So you'll see the first part of the doom. Nathan Peters mistakes him for the killer of Samuel Peters. Clearly it was an accident, but vengeance be blind, I guess. So if you go through, you'll see that he calls Lars a bloody Dane, and of course Lars Lind is the only person from Denmark. Up is Seaman John Naples, who is quite a peculiar guy. We find out who John is from the aftermath of when Philip Dahl kind of goes crazy and decides to lop off his leg with a sword. The way that we are able to, I guess, gleam which John this is left up to a little bit of a guess. You'll see that the doctor, Henry Evans, will call him John, and given that there's only a handful of Johns, you kind of just have to make your best guess as to which one is which. The kind of mystery out of this whole situation just lies in the fact that I still, having gone through this and looking at the Wikipedia, I have no reason why Philip Dahl attacked him. Just not even a clue. Next up, we have Renfred Radjub. He is one of a few Indian seamen who all kind of just hang out together. In this scene, we can see that Renfred Radjub is relaxing, and we can match a name to a face once we see that his cot is number 51. He dies, unfortunately, through illness that we can see with Henry Evans attending to him. So next up is Seaman Abraham Akbar. We are able to deduce who Abraham Akbar is just by the cot numbering. So we can see we have 51, we have 54, and then we have 53. So we can deduce that 52 is the number that's missing, and that's how we compare him to the face. And as we saw with Christian Wolff, he was crushed by the Kraken, and then eventually, I guess, fatally crushed by the cannon. So go easy on the guy. Don't blame him for Christian Wolff's death. After Abraham, we have William Wasim. William Wasim is identified much the same way. We can see that 53 is the cot belonging to William Wasim, and he is the only one out of his bed, attending to our boy Solomon Syed. But unlike the others, William Wasim is a victim of occupational health and safety. Clearly, he was crushed by falling cargo. And last of the Indian seamen, we have Solomon Syed. He is quite possibly the easiest to identify because he's in his bed, he has his number, and the fact that William Wasim physically goes out of his way to call him Syed. So, no mystery there. He succumbs to illness, if you couldn't figure it out already. Up next, we have Hamadou Diom, who, for me, was probably one of the harder characters to get. I full out guessed, and simply because I'm going to call him a bit more dark-skinned to be more like someone from Sierra Leone. You're supposed to guess with the cot that's remaining in the Doom Act 2. I would never have gotten that, and of course, Hamadou dies when he is spiked with the same spike from the mermaid that killed Chiho Tan. So, complete opposite to that hard one, we have Henry Brennan. He is probably the easiest to deduce, simply because First Mate actually physically calls out his name during this scene. And so, when you go around to explore the rest of the situation, you can actually see that Brennan has his hand out to his ear, physically hearing that the First Mate is calling him. And then, of course, to make things even easier, you can see that he was knifed by Captain Witterel, so no mysteries left there. Next up, we have Alexander Booth, who is another, dark-skinned individual. Hailing from England, he's supposed to have an English accent, is supposed to be the way that you figure him out. But once you get down to the very end, you kind of figure out which one is Alexander and which one is Hamadou. He, of course, meets his end because he decided to get on the boat with stupids. Next up, we have Patrick O'Hagan. We identify Patrick O'Hagan during the calling. He is actually called out to by Samuel Galligan, who, if you actually open up and look at the dialogue, or I guess just listen, you'll see that he calls out to O'Hagan to see if he's still able to row, and of course he is not because he has been speared. Next up, we have George Shirley. George is easier to identify because he is actually having a conversation with Wei Li. As you can see, he's kind of grouped in with the Asians. And unfortunately, he doesn't have a death screen. The last thing you see is him actually trying to pull Christian Wolff off the cannon before they both explode. And last but not least is Samuel Peters. Obviously, Samuel Peters is Nathan's brother. So a big part is being able to discern Nathan Peters from Samuel Peters. But once you figure out the two, you realize that Samuel Peters doesn't make it past Chapter 1, Part 1, when he dies by falling cargo. And that's it. We've made it through all 60. So enjoy your tea. Definitely enjoy the surprise that you get to see through the bargain. Spoilers, they killed the monkey. So, as a treat for sticking through the video, I wanted to leave you with this. If you actually solve 0 identities, or I think up to 28, you get the insurance assessment, and it's not very good. In fact, the insurance assessment is followed up with this letter from Jane Bird, writing to inform you of the unfortunate news that Dr. Evans has passed away after succumbing to his illness shortly after receiving your package. Although his health was generally poor, receiving the Obra Dinn book in such an incomplete state further disheartened him so thoroughly that he was unable to recover. He used his final moments to express the extreme regret he felt with trusting such a remarkable task to you, the idiot. So yeah, you can add yourself to the list of murderers, you monster. But that's it. Thanks for watching, you guys. I really appreciate it. If you liked the video and want to see more, please help me out by subscribing. I would greatly appreciate it. But that's it. Bye for now.